having the seminar over this lunchtime. It's quite informal, quite relaxed. We don't want anybody to feel they have to sit rigid in their chairs, particularly our students in the back, and we're really delighted to have some students here today, as well as academic staff and colleagues from outside of the university. John probably needs no introduction. He's well known to most of you already, I'm sure, but today he's going to talk about policing in Northern Ireland in terms of community confidence particularly, and I'm sure some of you may have seen the opinion piece in the Belfast Telegraph. Was it yesterday or the day before? Yesterday. So we're sort of building up a bit of steam in terms of the research impact of the work that John is doing, and Johnny Byrne as well, of course. As I say, quite informal. Just feel free to ask questions afterwards. John will talk for about half an hour or so. I know some people want to get off to the Ref Roadshow afterwards, which is at 1:15. We won't berate you if you slide out the door when the time comes. So we hope to be done in about an hour. We want you to come back, so we don't want you here for 2 hours and then have lost the will to live. And I'll pass over to John. Thanks very much.
Thanks to everybody coming. They managed to make it to block 16, remarkable. And I'm sitting slightly to the side here because I'm in the glare of this projector. And I know sort of we're into week 12, and you know, people are starting to get a bit jaded with sort of teaching, and certainly the academic staff and the students as well. So hopefully, at least it'll keep your minds wandering too far for the next hour on this sort of whole issue of policing we're going to talk about today. And essentially the talk today, it's really, as I've described it, as a commentary on confidence, normality, and community in relation to policing very broadly in Northern Ireland. Get underway today. What I really want to say is that today's talk, it's not, I suppose, designed to be just another critical commentary of PSNI or the policing board or any of the policing institutions having a go at what they are or are not doing on either sort of operational or strategic areas. Because having sort of worked on both sides, if you like, and as a sort of academic critical friend, to put it mildly, for some quarters, and also having worked as a consultant for PSNI in the past, I think it'd be far too simplistic to sit here today and simply say, you know, more needs to be done. That's always the easy answer. And on one hand, I think when we look at the current state of Northern Irish affairs generally, we can see that, you know, by and large, the vast bulk of the policing project started way back in 1999 under Patton. The vast bulk of that has been completed. So rather, I would prefer to, you know, in terms of that broad majority confidence and acceptance in policing, I prefer to use the space today, as I said, having worked on both sides, to really work towards what I would sort of call more enabling thinking around policing, but also at the same time considering why, on the other hand, policing is still so problematic in the country today. Because I think for too long, society here has tended to remain wedded to what I've really, I've talked to Johnny about this, it's been wedded to this sort of disabling policing debate. And what I'm getting at is that because of the political and the social pressures associated with getting policing right as part of the wider policing reforms under Patton, arguments related to policing at both sort of institutional, political and at community levels have continually remained, I suppose, polemic over the last 10 years, anchored around debates on success or failure. It's working, it's not working. It's a sort of ongoing tussle between the policing bodies and community experiences on the ground. And I suppose this is very symptomatic of what Mary O'Rourke always said, you know, policing was always part of this idea, the final piece of the jigsaw, that it could be got right and all the other pieces of the jigsaw would fall into place. And some of you may, I mean, that is in itself a very simplistic analysis, but I think for too long we have this, I suppose what we could call the unproblematic majority of Northern Ireland, the sort of, for want of a better term, a Middle England of Northern Ireland, as that large sort of broad group of people who have not experienced the sharp end of the conflict, or those sections of society not suffering from socio-economic deprivation, marginalisation and interface issues. I mean, certainly the Joseph Rowntree research lunch today only goes to make that point. And also those sections of society who have tended to gain most from the broader social transformations as a result of the broader peace process. And for too long has that particular section of society been wheeled out as the sort of yardstick of policing success in the country, without due regard to significant sections of mainly loyalist and Republican urban working class communities. And we have here, I suppose, the start of this bigger policing debate that's put forward many times by policing scholar David Bailey, one of the former oversight commissioners here in Northern Ireland, and that he has always contended that policing works best where it's needed least. And I think if we were to blindly accept the 80% confidence figures that the policing board put out over the last number of years, there's certainly going to be much to talk about today. So hopefully the commentary is going to consider some of this grey area or middle ground between these contentions as part of what is still a very complex policing landscape. While moving towards, as I said, trying to get, I suppose, an enabling mode of thinking which attempts to consider the reality of where we are in 2012, not just how far we've come, and also how we can move forward with policing in order to bring everyone along, not simply having this majority looking back and being glad things weren't as bad as they were in the past. Sorry, I missed the slide there. So what I want to move on to there, and I suppose an important starting point for any debate on normality and confidence is through the current state of policing by the PSNI. Really is, I suppose, what you could call a social and political marker of where they sit as part of the wider policing picture. And especially through their delivery of community policing, or policing with the community, which is always sort of the rubric of PAT, really is this symbolic form of normalised, normal-type policing. And at an operational level, and beyond certainly some of the very positive developments of the Chief Constable and undoubted pockets of good practice on the ground, community policing as a means of tailoring, as a means of anchoring, and also engaging PSNI service to local communities is not being delivered in a widespread fashion. I think that's important. It's not being delivered in a widespread fashion that the PSNI and the Policing Board would suggest, especially within our urban, socio-economically marginalised loyalist and Republican communities. Because it's important to understand this as a means of getting to a bit more of a nuanced debate beyond whether policing is simply working or it's not, as part of the still shifting transitional landscape we're in, and especially so because it is in these areas are having a ripple effect on the rest of society. So I think they do have an effect on us all, so we need to try and understand that picture a bit more clearly. And I suppose, firstly, of course, to start off very generally, some of the limited successes of community policing in certain areas is not, of course, solely the fault of PSNI, primarily due to a whole host of security-related issues, limiting the scope of normal policing, whatever that is. I'll come back to the security situation later on. And I think this was captured quite well by Hugh Ord just before his departure as Chief Constable. He very simply said that, just quote him here, "The threat of domestic terrorism is always present in Northern Ireland. Because officers are now more visible in communities where, historically, they would not have patrolled on foot or bicycle, they are more vulnerable to attack." So that's one, I suppose, side of the coin, if you like. But by the same token, it's important, I think, for PSNI and the board to recognise that successes in community policing do not negate the realities of perceived and actual deficits faced by the loyalist and Republican communities, which has manifested itself in terms of limited and also in some cases waning community support and confidence in the PSNI's ability to deliver normal policing. Indeed, I've pegged up a few reports here. There is a host of empirical, independent evidence out there to support such questions or such issues in and around whether or not policing is working. Yet quite often, I think as part of this bigger debate, because of the political necessity of policing needing to be got right, quite often, to suggest otherwise is to engage in some sort of, as I've encountered, certainly some sort of apostasy to be avoided at all costs in the public eye. So that's the one side. I'll not dwell and go into any too much detail of some of that evidence. Certainly we can maybe tease that out in the questions, but I want to explore the other side of the community policing coin, rather than consider the limitations of policing as delivered in these harder to reach areas. And what I want to do is examine, well, where is community policing actually successful, and consider the parameters of Bailey's thesis as I've talked about. And I suppose that the example I want to use, and this is an area I've been working on for the last number of months now, is the example of Neighbourhood Watch, Northern Ireland Neighbourhood Watch schemes, much lauded by the PSNI and the Policing Board, and certainly on any of the PSNI literature, noted as a vehicle for reducing fear of crime, fostering community spirit and improving the environment, which all sounds great. And with nearly 600 registered schemes in the country in 2012, it would initially seem to be a fairly successful strand of community policing practice. Yet when we actually examine, this is part of the work we've been doing, when we examine the location of schemes set against a range of socio-demographic variables, it presents the most stark example of Bailey's contention that community policing works best where it's needed least. And certainly on the basis of some of that work, only 14% of schemes in 2012 are located in areas with a majority, that is 80% plus Catholic population. That's a score the policing board would use in terms of crime rates, in terms of judging the areas. Indeed, when you drill down into some of those statistics a little further, only 0.5% of neighbourhood watch schemes are located in the most deprived 10% of society, and 90% of neighbourhood watch schemes are located in the least 10% deprived areas of society. So that's quite stark. And also, I suppose, related more to crime and to policing, only 1.1% of neighbourhood watch schemes are located in the top 10% most crime-affected areas in Northern Ireland, with 89% of neighbourhood watch schemes located in the bottom 5% or least crime-affected areas in Northern Ireland. So those figures, I mean, certainly we can maybe tease some of those out in the discussion, but between the realities of policing faced by marginalised low-income and public communities and between our symbolic neighbourhood watch schemes lies a truth somewhere in between about the real organised community policing project. Yet the standoff between, I suppose, the realities of the empirical realities and the politics of good policing is definitely, it's a nettle that has yet to be grasped beyond what have been, over the last decade, a range of technocratic measures of policing success owned and defined by the policing institutions themselves, just looking at the DPP figures I think the Statistics Policing Board have consistently produced. So that's something we need to look at. But I suppose below some of these broader debates, and again this is at a general level so far, there are a number of issues which are seldom discussed as part of the community policing debate, but which impact on confidence on the ground. And in this respect, I mean, examining PSNI at an organisational level, one of the obvious questions to ask is, what do PSNI actually mean when they say they're delivering community policing? And this is not in the, I suppose, the technical sense of what they have said in the policing plan for the Chief Constable's 3 Ps, sort of personal, professional, protective policing, but rather to take a deeper look at what they mean. And certainly back in 2008 and 2009, I was involved in a team which helped to design and develop PSNI's first ever dedicated neighbourhood policing training programme, which is accredited by the Chartered Management Institute. That training programme has by and large now withered on the vine, noted unofficially to me by a senior PSNI officer as not being very good value for money. So in this regard, I'm not quite sure, and I'm not aware of any change, I'm not quite sure what the current new generation of PSNI officers, what they're actually being taught in terms of community policing of the 3 Ps. What is the message getting through, and where are they learning that beyond some of the nuts and bolts of policing and arrests and traffic? Because certainly the training is there, but as far as I'm aware at present, it's dormant. So that's something to be looked at. Added to this, I mean, certainly in recent conversation with senior PSNI officers, it is very clear that there lacks any sort of tangible, coherent organisational strategy with regard to what policing of the community actually means throughout the organisation and within and between the different departments. And again, one of the quotes that I suppose I took away from those conversations, what a senior PSNI officer said to me, we're trying to implement a Rolls-Royce policing strategy without due regard to the engine we have underneath. So when coupled with figures from the policing board themselves, which indicates that only about 10% of PSNI officers are actually dedicated to neighbourhood policing role, community policing roles. That's about 800 officers for a population of 1.7 million. We are left, arguably, with a community policing architecture which does not appear to support the gloss, I have to say, of the 3 Ps, personal, professional, protective policing, as laudable as Matt Baggett's vision of that actually is. And of course, what I'm talking about here is not to say by any means or any stretch of the imagination PSNI is actually a bad organisation. I mean, it is a world leader in many areas, accountability, human rights, public order, but to name a few. But really, we are, in many ways, starting to see the outworkings of some of these difficulties with community policing in terms of PSNI's ability to deal with some of the everyday volume crimes that communities face, which we have to remember are concentrated mainly in those socio-economically deprived, loyalist and Republican areas. And just a few of the most up-to-date statistics you can find on PSNI clearance rates. We have a range here: hate crime at 18%, property crime 17%, burglary only 11% cleared, and of course the recent debates around paramilitary policing, only 4% of those crimes are actually cleared. And also interestingly, violent crime is actually up nearly 60% from 1998, or compared to 1998, 1999. And while compared, I suppose, if you look across England and Wales, these figures are, in some regards, broadly comparable. But it's in view of the resources at the disposal of PSNI. I mean, it's where the sort of level of service that, in the eyes of marginalised communities, the levels of service they're actually receiving, or lack of it, it only tends to feed into this sense of abnormality about policing, that normal policing is not there and is not being done as promised. So out of this debate, I mean, this is a general commentary at this stage. What I'm saying is that we need to address two key issues here. First of all, we need to be honest at a public and I think operational level as to the effectiveness or not of the broader community policing project. Where does it work and where is it not working? And secondly, we need to consider how we can create much more inclusive, enabling spaces to engage local people with local policing needs. Because as we've witnessed with the district policing partnerships, I don't need to go into any of the critiques of those we've seen over the past decade. But again, they have done little to feed many of these sort of technocratic measurement, statistical debates about policing, which has left loyalist and public communities in limbo, waiting to see changes as part of that which they have been promised but not yet received. So we can only wait, I suppose, and it's part of another debate for the policing and community safety partnerships, which will replace the DPPs and community safety partnerships. Wait till those come in and see if they can provide a more structured basis to fully and sensibly engage in getting policing right at a community rather than a political level, as it's tended to be over the last decade. But the debates around community policing or community-type policing, they're only one spoke of the, I suppose, the bigger policing wheel, which is why I do now want to turn to what is the ever-present security situation. And you know, it certainly doesn't take anybody in the room, you know, any great deal of analysis to look at even the newspapers, news reports over the last week or so to realise that we are, according to MI5, in a de facto state of severe terrorist threat. But before we get into some of the issues, I think a key reference point for consideration is that from a PSNI perspective, such threats and this overall severe threat undoubtedly has a significant influence upon their operations in terms of officer safety and the delivery of normal policing service. From a PSNI perspective, we cannot, you can't ignore that. And arguably, the threat to PSNI is potentially higher than that descriptive severe threat from MI5, because if we look back last year, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary produced a report in 2011 which very clearly and concisely stated that PSNI only classify about 25% of terrorist incidents as such within their own technical definitions of the term. So in this respect, I think there certainly needs to be a greater understanding and a greater, I suppose, acknowledgement at the community level of these pressures and how that is affecting normal policing. Yet nobody in the public sphere tends to be discussing that. It's business as usual. Matt Baggett says we're well resourced enough. The politicians are saying very little. And within this picture, I suppose, getting into a bit more detail, some of the questions seldom asked is about community experiences set within this security context, whether loyalist or whether Republican. I suppose whether the extremities of post-conflict society coalesce for some people into everyday experiences. Because there are two contradictions here which impact on community experiences. of engagement and confidence and normality in terms of policing. Because firstly we have, for example, the rolling checkpoints, the stops and searches, the house raids, the armoured Land Rovers, the fortified police stations. As necessary as they are, they do still retain the potential to alienate communities who, by the same token, are being told that policing has really changed. So at a representative political level, beyond the ritual condemnations of attacks that we do get, we need some honesty about what communities should expect as part of the necessary policing which is required to deal with this threat. And secondly, the Chief Constable, he stated last year, and again I'll just read out this quote for you, he stated, "It would be a mistake to say that policing can be separated into security policing and community policing when officers rely upon community support to do their job." That was on the BBC from last year. And while and very much in an ideal, on I suppose a theoretical plane, effective community policing would feed up into the intelligence channels as part of counter-terrorism approaches. As I've already argued, policing with the community is not being effectively delivered in marginalised loyalists and public in areas where paramilitary policing remains very much active, especially in the Republican side. So without those connections, I think by default, PSNI's options are largely limited to the security end of the policing spectrum. And again, looking at some of the evidence in and around this, HMIC, they recently noted that PSNI have approximately 4 times as many officers dedicated to public order policing and 6 times up as many officers dedicated to intelligence type roles as most similar forces in England and Wales, as I described. And again, there are necessities of that. But when combined with the 10%, or the 10% of officers only dedicated to the community policing role, I think quite, contradiction to Matt Baggett's assertion, the separation of community policing and counter-terrorism would appear to be the reality. So I think a degree of openness about policing styles would actually help to open dialogue about how best to mitigate the impacts of counter-terrorism policing on the ground. And again, that's certainly something that I've been working on down in G District and can maybe tease out a little more in the questions. But beyond these contentions, and again, I'll explain why the picture of Stephen Nolan up there, I do want to touch upon the whole area of paramilitary policing and the grim reality of its existence. I mean, it has been quite prevalent in the press over the last number of weeks. And just to give you, I suppose, a bit of sort of a background to this, my colleague Johnny Byrne there, I mean, he was writing and researching about paramilitary policing and the impacts at the community level and on young people nearly 10 years ago. More recently, Johnny and myself produced research about the continuance of paramilitary policing within loyalist and Republican communities with much consternation and furrowing of brows by the policing institutions. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, that's only in 2012, in spite of us knowing that this is happening, it's only in 2012, since the Policing Board published their recent human rights report, and after a long campaign by WIMP's Paul Smith through Public Achievement, they've been campaigning long and hard on the issue. It's only now that the Chief Constable has taken up the gauntlet and pledged to crack down on paramilitary assaults and shootings. And I think Matt Baggett, in many ways, he's actually been very correct to call our largely silent politicians to order on the issue and challenge them to make an impact on some of these socio-economic conditions which undoubtedly sustain conditions conducive to paramilitary activity on both sides. Because by and large, the reality of paramilitarism for such communities remains hidden from the political and remains hidden from the policing discourse generally in society in Northern Ireland. And indeed, I mean, with those involved in paramilitary activity, whether in the Loyalist or Republican side, painted as by Mark McGuinness as conflict junkies and Neanderthals, attacks, I mean, we've also had attacks levied at the coherence of any political ideologies that they have. And again, further arguments about their existence, being underpinned by crime and criminality and organised crime and drugs. But a significant issue with this frame of analysis is that localised paramilitary policing has been conflated with the wider national terrorist threat and packaged as this aberration of the peacetime context in which we now live. So by othering, in many ways, the actual basis for the impacts and effects of paramilitary violence and limiting debate to statistical fluctuations, there's less than there was, or we're dealing with them from a police perspective, it actually ignores many of the uncomfortable truths that people in certain areas of the country, for their own whatever reasons, still support paramilitary policing, although certainly from research of doing that is very distinct from support. There is no support for the actual overt terrorist bombing type campaigns, but there is still support for paramilitary policing. Also, in many areas, people are still ambivalent as to who polices their communities. That too is a fact. And also the other very uncomfortable truth is that, as we've witnessed last week down in Derry, people still fail to deliver their children for shootings by appointment. That is still happening in 2012. So we need to be realistic and address the uncomfortable truths and seek to deal with them. But it is, however, a shame that such questions are not out in the open, and they are only now being asked, certainly by Matt Baggett. And I think the other big issue is that the way it's being dealt with, in this sort of populist, shameful manner, as we witnessed through, what I have to say was a completely shambolic piece of public service broadcasting by the BBC and the Stephen Nolan show about the issue. It was pretty much a disgrace last week. So we need to deal with this seriously, we need to deal with it properly, and we need to deal with it effectively. That is not necessarily happening. So those are two, I suppose, key strands, looking at sort of community policing, is it working and where it's working. Some of the, I suppose, at the other end of the scale then, are security, are counter-terrorism type debates. And I've taken a step back from what I've covered so far, and trying to move, I suppose, towards some sort of concluding remarks. I originally set to consider, or try to look at some more enabling modes of policing around, thinking around policing, trying to look beyond some of the traditional arguments around confidence and normality and community, and consider where we are as a means of understanding some of the less obvious but still very pressing issues for policing in 2012. And set against a range of those issues, there is, of course, there's a degree of fluidity to all the arguments I've made in terms of where it's happening and the extent of where these issues and things are happening. But in many ways, this is precisely the argument. We don't actually or accurately know what this picture of policing is. And certainly with the politics of change to policing having dominated the past decade, the policing institutions have failed to attempt to define policing need beyond the generic statistical parameters, limiting understandings of what confidence and normality actually mean within specific contexts. Certainly the rigid adherence to the 80% confidence figures in PSNI is quite baffling sometimes. So this is, looking forward, there are key challenges for the future. We need to improve synergy between research, evidence-based policy making, and the delivery of policing. That sounds like a researcher saying we need more research, but it is the reality. And indeed, certainly my experienced colleagues, as of the recent Political Studies Association conference, colleagues in criminology, when they can readily gain academic access to counter-terrorism units in England and Wales as part of research, as part of getting policing right here, I think we need to look a bit more seriously at how we can make policing better, even for the less contentious forms of normal type policing, community policing. As academics, we are here to help, so I think there's some well-needed research there needing to be done. But undoubtedly, as we continue into another decade of policing, a key consideration for everyone as part of the bigger criminal justice and policing landscape, we need to break out of thinking that the PSNI should be at the centre of policing arrangements, especially as we move into the new community safety era, which I certainly don't have time to talk about today, because it is, of course, far too easy to blame PSNI alone for the lack of normalised policing, and mainly, but of course not limited to Republican loyalist areas. Because out of the us and them culture out of which we're emerging in Northern Ireland. Policing is now everyone's problem, owned by everyone, delivered by everyone. So to stand back and to point the finger of blame at any one organisation is undoubtedly to miss many of the problems of deep-rooted segregation, division and inequality, which for so long have been hidden under the veil of the conflict. And equally, I think the current regime, which we still have, of local tribal politics only serves to perpetuate this permanent state of division and divided society, which in many ways feeds into a lot of the problems which have just been talking about. So to let such politics pervade and dictate the new community safety era about which we're moving into under devolved policing and justice is to miss an opportunity for properly joined up community safety and criminal justice thinking. And I suppose, just finishing, it's as if where we are now in 2012, it's as if there's some sort of, as if through some sort of socio-political osmosis, that those removed from the sharp edges of crime and security in society almost expect a lot of these outstanding issues just to somehow fix themselves through the natural wastage of time. But I mean, for communities at the sharp end of policing, of criminality, of paramilitarism, time is moving much more slowly, and the ripples of those problems still continue to be felt by all of us in society. And the longer it takes to fix such issues, the more difficulty we will have with establishing any sense of normality in the policing or other sense. So on one hand, at present, I think the majority of society is peering down through what would have termed here a bit of a glass floor of policing, gladly accepting that as a society we aren't as bad as we were in the past. But on the other hand, this floor is also, this glass floor is acting as I suppose, a ceiling through which certain sections of society are gazing upwardly, still unable to reach that which they have been promised as part of the new beginning to policing over a decade on. And until we begin to move towards some more enabling modes of thought around policing beyond the police, as I've tried to sketch out today, I mean, I fear that I may be doing a very similar talk another decade down the line. Thank you.
Thanks, John. That was great, not least because I always struggled with the definition of what community policing actually meant, as I'm sure maybe other people in the room did as well. We'll just throw the floor open to questions, John, and you can take as many as you can between now and 1:15, so we've got 20 minutes. Anybody want to go first?
John, very thoughtful, very, very interesting. As a former police officer in the Met as well, I find it very, very interesting. But it leads into something like neighbourhood renewal. How different are we here in Northern Ireland in reality, places like inner city London? Surely it's the places you probably need to at least you have neighbourhood renewal in London. Probably we're not that different in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the problems Belfast, Dublin, Manchester, where the argument goes we still suffer from many of the problems, but we have tended to see, this is what I'm getting at, we've tended to see over the last decade most of the problems we have in society as policing and security related problems, and it's only now a decade on that we have the new legislation which has created the Policing Community Safety Partnerships. We've got the Department of Justice just about to launch their new community safety strategy, and within that community safety strategy we have, there's talk of neighbourhood renewal, of cohesion, sharing, integration, interface violence. So we really need to try and push forward with that agenda, because in many ways we just haven't been doing it, in terms of these problems, which are very similar to everywhere else, and the police have tended to be the lowest common denominator out of all these problems, and they've had to pick up the pieces, and that again is all on top of the security threat, which does, certainly from a PSNI perspective, definitely limits their ability to do normal policing. In many cases, to get out of the Land Rovers is a health and safety issue. So, that's something I think over time will change, but we need to be working on that now.
Just a comment, I find it frightening and terrifying that officers have been put in a position in communities where they're not properly trained to work with communities. You said the training has been withdrawn. How could you wouldn't put a social worker in?
I don't know if it's been fully withdrawn, but I use that term deliberately, withered on the vine. I mean, but I suppose it's this bigger debate. If you look at police training, it's what we call it in Garnagle the hose pipe effect. First and foremost, police officers have to be trained to be police officers, and the other stuff you add in pushes something out the other end of the hose pipe. And I just don't get a sense of where officers are learning a lot of those skills and what it's about. And we actually look at that. If you look at that training in relation to the recent second part of the Windsor Review, they actually talk, and again this is maybe a point for the policing board, they actually talk about paying officers or giving a premium for officers who undertake accredited neighbourhood policing training. That's something we had here, and it wasn't good value for money, so it's now been put aside. So I don't know, I have no answers for PSNI internally about those.
Can I just say, yes, I work for Rural Community Network, and in the last 6 months we have had requests from 4 different neighbourhood teams from the place, and some of them have been new recruits in the last year who are saying that they're not youth workers, they're not community development workers, and that they're very much been thrown into the cold face to deal with antisocial behaviour issues, especially relating to young people. So I just want to make a comment to say that there's a valuable role there as well with the voluntary and community sector. That's how the police can make a link in the policing board and the higher level decision makers about the role that we also play in bringing that expertise to the police. But I've been really shocked in the last year at how many requests we are getting from ordinary police officers saying we don't have the training in this, we're not the experts, but we're expected to be dealing with this issue day and daily. So I think there needs to be some link up with the community and voluntary sector in terms of what we can also bring to the table.
So I mean, that's something Johnny and I have argued very hard for over the last week. Recently launched a report that was commissioned through the Belfast Conflict Resolution Consortium, and that looked at the decade of community safety in Northern Ireland, and we spent a great deal of time looking at the contributions of the voluntary and community sector to policing in Northern Ireland, and we created, as far as we can tell, a pretty new typology on that in terms of what sort of community organisations are contributing to the broad policing landscape and its widest senses. So maybe I can give you a copy of that report. But I mean, that is part, and I said maybe 3 years ago that I expected this churn of officers to stop with the freeze in recruitment, obviously impacting upon promotions. The argument was that officers would be stuck, if you like, for want of a better term, in their positions, and they wouldn't have the opportunity to do box tick promotion type work. They would have to stay in neighbourhood roles, but obviously that maybe is an issue still to be worked out, and what sort of officers are going through the neighbourhood teams. But again,
and the difficulty we have is that we have very limited funding because we are a voluntary organisation, but the police are asking us to help us to support programmes in their community. So we're saying, well, if we can only maybe bring £1,500 to the table, that's all we have. So it's even what kind of partnership or structure can be set up that we can assist them. We need the resources behind us as well also to do more in the community, because we're voluntary organisations ourselves. So we have a limited pot that we can bring to the table.
So then hopefully maybe the new PCSP structure as well, they will be able to get down. I know they have some ability at present to create ad hoc schemes to deal with particular issues that are not limited in size or scope, so hopefully that will address, but again, only time will tell.
I'm Paul Gow from the Policing Board. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for the Division Zenit, not out loud in this forum, but I'm just new into this role, and this is really interesting. There's a piece of research that the board commissioned by the Ulster Republican Consortium, and all of these issues were raised about how often and how long the tenure of a neighbourhood officer is, and the issue about training, and a whole host of issues about the type of policing they get. We met with the Assistant Chief Constable, Hamilton, who is now responsible for all of this, and he now has this new department bringing together all sort of equality, diversity and policing on the community side of things. And they accepted each of the 8 recommendations within that report, of which it is a lot to do with. And the training you talked about, you're absolutely right, they have said they are reviewing it.
The long finger.
Yeah, exactly. So we're trying to find out what is that going to look like. One of the issues that the consortium had, and it was from a whole range of organisations looking at Loyalist Republican communities and their experiences of policing, is about how the training is delivered, and that it isn't just that broad brush. They can get some type of basic training, but to be very aware of the intricacies of each individual neighbourhood and how new neighbourhood officer teams are linking in with the well-established neighbourhood sergeants, and that they're not just swooping in and not having what happens. And there's a whole tier of training, I think, that needs to happen as well. But we can share that research, and certainly the board are very keen to continue with some work with the public confidence, and in particular our 2 key strands of work this year in the outward piece of work that we're doing is loyalist Republican communities, working class communities, and young people.
Okay, I mean, I'll declare a bit of a conflict of interest because I was originally on that loyalist consortium and departed from it. But I think I fear a big issue about this is, as ever, money. A lot of that training was delivered under ring-fence patent money, and now that's now it actually has to come out of somebody's budget somewhere, and it's an additional thing. I worry that that will not be invested in fully, and we have this course ready to go, CMI level 3, and I'll say no more on it anyway. But certainly something which needs to be discussed here.
The board accept that, so it's good to hear that we have the additional evidence to be able to support the argument that this all needs to happen. So it's welcome.
It's been mentioned a couple of times about young people, and I think in relation to, it's not a question I'm going to ask you, John, it's just a comment or an observation, and an issue I think that needs to be debated. And young people we mentioned with two of the audience here, and I think in order for policing to move forward, so-called normal problems and those problems that exist throughout the United Kingdom in relation to policing have to be looked into, such as police attitudes towards young people, the treatment of young people. The Youth Justice Review team highlighted young people's views and perceptions of policing, and a lot of that came from direct interaction with police and police attitudes and mistreatment and abuse of young people. And also in research that Linda Moore and myself have recently conducted into children of imprisoned parents, the attitude of police officers to families of prisoners and people that police have worked with has raised very, very serious questions and issues about what is being done in relation to policing within our communities.
Okay, I can't comment on that beyond. I mean, that is part of that, especially for young people, a bigger spectrum of contact. We know we have to do is flick to the recent human rights report from the board, and look at the average age of people who come in contact for stops and searches, whether through PSO or tense legislation, and majority focused on young males. So that's of course the case in the rest of the UK, but I know my colleague Johnny has done some work in young people in policing, but something to be worked on.
John, one of the things that you mentioned is the constant reference to the 80% satisfaction rate in terms of public confidence. Are those statistics, can you drill down by ward to see what the public, no, I don't think so.
Can't. No, it's because I was told it was too costly to note where policing, that was the line I was told once from the policing board, it would cost too much money to get that sort of information.
Now that's where the research needs to be done. That's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, I've argued for that for a long time. You need that. I mean, certainly with regard to that neighbourhood watch information, that was done, and the information is available down to the census output area, all 5,022 census output areas in Northern Ireland. I was able to get data about crime and disorder rankings, about deprivation. So there's no match. So why are we not going down? Undoubtedly, it's costly, but our counter argument is what's the price of not knowing about attitudes to policing on the ground? Because in the long run, it's just going to cost a lot more.
And there's a bit of an issue about the frequency that we do the public confidence. I don't know if people's public confidence changed that much within 6 months or 12 months. It's probably better to invest the money, the board to invest the money and do something every 2 years and have that broken down.
Allow the PCSPs to pick it up at local level,
Yes,
perhaps.
exactly.
Sorry, can I ask you that human rights report you're talking about? Who wrote that, or what?
Our Policing Board's annual human rights report, I think that was published. Yeah, it's all online.
George?
I'm a trained economist, so I know next to nothing about it. I found it fascinating, very informative. In fact, I was struck by how much has gone into that and how many aspects there are into the questions that you raised. I'm also struck by the lack of the million-dollar question, money. Would more money have solved problems? Is it a question of lack of funding? Is it a question of allocation of funds given the budget? How efficient is that allocation? Do you know anything about that?
Okay, well that's an interest.
I'm saying that from the point of view that if we look across the sea, then there is that accusation that community officers are actually a cheap substitute into real policing. Right? That is actually the case for all sorts of places in England at this moment. Is there something like that happening here? When you say community policing, am I supposed to read something more than just the word community policing? One thing. Second, the neighborhood watch cannot possibly actually be a good substitute for real policing. So to say that they've been set up and they're working and so on and so forth is probably a measurement of something underlying without actually knowing what's going on. Or that is my suspicion here when it comes to money.
Absolutely. Well, certainly very easily in the neighbourhood watch side of things, I mean, there's a whole raft of research over the years which has shown that the neighbourhood watch tax increased fear of crime and it isn't actually effective, but symbolically it's there. It's a symbol of the police being there in connection to the communities. But I suppose moving on to the money question, if you look at the bigger issue of resources, I mean, the policing budget in Northern Ireland is over £1 billion per year. We still have one of the highest police to population ratios in the Western world. So obviously, when I talked about HMIC's report and the shape of the organisation in terms of the necessity, Wednesday alarm, the necessity of public order officers and the necessity of intelligence officers, because we don't have mutual aid from England and Wales or the Republic. We do need proportionately more resources. Yet communities consistently argue, in spite of the numbers of officers, we don't see enough officers on the ground, whether or not we need them. So it's part of this debate, and the Chief Constable consistently says we are well enough resourced. He just got another £250 million to deal with the dissident threat, which he says he's now putting into helping combat paramilitary policing. So it's a costly exercise here because of the conflict and the need for the number of officers, but quite where the shape of the organisation, I think, is the issue. The shape of the organisation isn't quite as flat as it would perhaps be in England or Wales because of this need to retain the counter-terrorism capacity. So I think that sucks up a lot of money and does undoubtedly impact on the number of officers which can be freed up on the ground.
Right.
Thank you. An excellent presentation, John, if I may say so. And I wish I had your PowerPoint ability. 2 questions. Do you yourself have a clear idea of what community policing means? And if so, what are the PSNI not doing that you think they should do in that regard? And secondly, you didn't mention anywhere, I think, the effect of legacy issues on policing confidence. And I wondered whether you think that those issues are important in the loyalist and Republican communities that you talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly the legacy, I deliberately left legacy, just didn't have enough time to include everything, but undoubtedly legacy is still impacting. You have talk of the recruitment of agents, you've got supergrass trials, you've got the effectiveness of OTT, you've got the whole debate now around the police ombudsman, although Mike Maguire's now in to steady the ship, hopefully. So that does impact on confidence, the recruitment of the 300 RUC officers back in, and communities are, what we're hearing on the ground, communities are sceptical of this. What has changed, what is changing, how are we dealing with the past, and that does impact on the present. And again, it's back to what I said at the start, we're stuck in these sort of polemic debates. Chief Constable on record saying, well, we need to put money in, can't keep putting money endlessly into the past because we need to police the future, yet people need some sort of resolution. I think that is very much symptomatic of the bigger apathy as to how we deal with the past. And again, the police, because they were the main, I suppose, protagonists in the conflict, they are still the focus of a lot of attention, although I think that's convenient for other people who aren't stepping up to the mark. In terms of community policing, I will try to claim some ownership of it, how that was, that's what I've worked on over the last number of years, and probably the best overview. I mean, there's so many interpretations of community policing, what it is, what it's not. But probably the most succinct one came from Peter Sheridan back in 2002, and they still used 5 principles of policing the community: accountability, empowerment, partnership, problem solving, and service delivery. And we can put any sorts of definitions and all sorts of, you know, interpretations of the 3 Ps, confidence, all these sorts of issues around it. But I think at the bottom of it all is the need for officer discretion and the ability for the police to work in communities and work with the grain of communities. And a big problem over the last decade has been officers, you know, banging their heads off the walls, they tell me, absolutely constrained by targets and target culture. And now we've got, on top of this, we now have Matt Baggett has now introduced another target metric for community policing. So if officers are not up to whatever measures that he's set forth on community policing, that will potentially impact on the promotions. So we've got one of the most accountable, overseen police organisations in the world, and that is constraining officers, and it's not allowing them out onto the streets. And certainly part of the bigger picture of the DPPs, you know, officers would say to go and get their monthly parking tickets in the one night just to get their monthly statistics. They could go off and do normal policing the rest of the month or the rest of the time. So that's I think that is a big problem, because we're, you know, as a society we've needed such oversight and accountability of police, and that we're afraid, I think, to let go a little and allow officers that level of discretion and neighbourhood teams and free up staff from a lot of bureaucracy. I mean, I suppose the biggest one was the purchase of the niche computer system which they used. It was too costly to purchase the mobile car unit of that, so officers had to come back into the police stations every time to fill in all the details. So obviously technology is kicking in, and we have Blackberries and all the rest of it, but I think we just need the big issue, whatever principles or guidance we use, it's about allowing officers the fullest capacity, financially, operationally, to work with community need and not be constrained by central targets. Because if you look even back to Hugh Ward's tenure, he went a long way to centralising the PSNI compared to RUC. I've had PSNI officers tell me they had more operational autonomy when they were RUC than they were in the PSNI, or created the fewer policing districts, so greater central control. So that to me is a big issue, and if we could do that, that would allow officers and sections and groups of officers to work where they're actually needed. But again, that's a sort of, I suppose, simplistic answer in view of the threats and the problems which they face perhaps in doing that.
Well, John, it just remains for me to say thank you. So the mark of a really good seminar is that when people leave and think about some of the things afterwards and say, oh, I wish I had have asked. So I'm fortunate that my office is next door to John, so I'll knock the door later on and say, now about that 80%, let's have a discussion about that again. So on behalf of everybody, thanks very much. This is part of our IPAC seminar series, which is the Interinstitute Peace and Conflict seminar group, and most of the seminars are specifically related to some aspect of peace and conflict, whether in the context of Northern Ireland or internationally. So